Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the next episode of End of Growth broadcast of the Prism, where we explore all aspects of leadership. Over the last few weeks, we've been talking about leading in a crisis, and today we're going to be continuing that theme. Last week, we had a very lengthy discussion around some of the strategies and tactics of pricing during a crisis, pricing your products or services. Today, we're going to pivot once again, and we're going to pivot to the ethical and moral obligations that public and private companies may have when pricing their products in a crisis. So once again, we have David Mok joining us. He's a pricing expert, great presence on LinkedIn, many theories and a lot of experience in pricing products across healthcare and technology. Also joined by Nicolas, our Integral Principal and Senior Consultant, Tim Dunn, who's our Chief Commercial Officer, and Jim Hotaling, who's our President, and then myself, Mike Kerouac, the Vice Chairman. So we're going to open up the floor today and get David talking. If many of you may have seen some of the headlines in today's news, and it became very relevant. Gilead is going to be introducing a therapeutic product for COVID-19. I think it's Remdesivir, and they're under fire because Gilead's history is charging significant pricing for products. They were famous for introducing an HIV therapeutic years ago and charging $1,000 per pill, and Congress got involved and all kinds of activist groups got involved, and they had a lot of pressure on them. They've got a new CEO since then, but everybody's just waiting to see what the pricing is on this COVID-19 drug, and a lot of the activists are waiting to pounce. One of the lobbyists said this is a chance for Gilead not to be greedy bastards. That was the quote. So we got to get into that discussion a little bit. These are publicly held companies. They answer to boards of directors. They answer to shareholders, many of them institutional shareholders who have billions of dollars invested in these companies. They expect returns on those investments. So what is the moral and ethical obligation of these companies to price drugs in the middle of a crisis like we're in today? If they're introducing a COVID-19 therapeutic, does Gilead deserve to make a profit? Or are they expected to, to break even and do the right thing for the end user, the consumer of the drug? So David, why don't you give us some of your thoughts on this space? You probably lived through it a few times.
Yeah, hey, thank you, Mike, and good morning, everyone. This is David. I'll share with you my thoughts. First of all, what should guide us in our decision making, right? And there's a legal side, and then there's the ethical side. And let me touch on the legal side first. And I'm going to say that there is no legal guidance in terms of how companies should be doing around ethical pricing. So there's absolutely zero legal guidance. And where the law really focuses is where we're really focused on is really around anti-competitive behaviors, right? So for example, price fixing is one of the things that the law is trying to protect. It's really anything that's anti-competitive is where the law is at. And there are some other legal exposure you want to be careful of around price discrimination, price gouging. Believe it or not, is actually completely legal, with the exception of one scenario. In a state of emergency, the government can actually step in and actually, rein business in if the prices become unreasonable. But that's only during the state of emergency. Outside of that, there's really no legal requirements on ethical pricing. So then the question becomes, well, how should I bound? Where should I set my ethical? Where should I set my pricing? And I want to throw this out for the audience to kind of noodle on. I think the first thing you want to think about is, what do you stand for? And the second thing is, what are some of your goals that you're trying to do? And then those things can then define where you want to bound your, what constraints you want to put on your pricing. So in some cases you can have less constraints. In other cases you can have more constraints, right? So less constraints meaning, hey, look, I can price whatever I can get, right? Because the transaction is purely, it's not coerced. It's all, it's all uncoerced transactions. It's all based on the will of the consumer. So that's one extreme. The other extreme is, hey, I want to make my products available to everybody, regardless, even if some of my consumers are able to cover the cost, because there is a social ethical responsibilities that I want to put upon that I want to be able to create, for my company. So those are some of the things to think about as you kind of noodle on your pricing. And
so David, quick question: what do you think has a heavier weight, investor opinion or consumer activist opinion? And let me read you something quickly from the Gilead article in the Boston Globe this morning. This is a guy who's an analyst from an investment house in New York. And he said, Gilead has generated attractive returns for its investors from treating hepatitis C patients, from treating HIV and turning HIV into a chronic disease, with ease of treatment, building a really important global stockpile of antiviral drugs like Tamiflu for influenza. So what's special about COVID? Why shouldn't Gilead be allowed to make profits? So Wall Street's saying, hey, they should be able to behave the way they've always behaved. They dealt with hepatitis C outbreaks. They dealt with influenza outbreaks. They dealt with HIV. They made good money on all of those. What's different? So investors are putting a lot of pressure on Gilead to do what they've done in the past and maximize their pricing opportunities. At the same time, the U.S. government and the activists are doing the opposite. And, one guy even said that Gilead shouldn't mistake a hand outstretched by the federal government in the wrong way, because it quickly can be turned into a fist if Gilead doesn't behave correctly. So if you're the Gilead CEO, what are you doing here? You're in business to make money, but yet you've got all this activist and consumer pressure that they want you to basically break even or lose money because we're in a crisis. How would you think a CEO would balance those two types of situations?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. I could certainly give you my opinion and views, and love to get others to weigh in on it as well. Here's how I like to think about what ethical pricing looks like. Right? We talked a little bit about the bounds. In fact, ethical pricing is completely up to you as the business, because there are no legal bounds. And the way I like to think about it is, you want to tether your price to the value that you create with your product, and strike the balance with a sense of fairness. And I think if you can accomplish that, that'll set you, and I think they'll set the company up for success. And let me give you some example, right? So Gilead, same company, launched a drug a few years ago. It's called, what is it called? It's a hepatitis C drug for $84,000. I think it's called Solostat or something like that. And there was a lot of outrage at the time as well. In fact, insurance companies saying this is crazy. $84,000 for a treatment, which equates to about $1,000 per drug. This is nuts. But insurance companies continue to pay for it. Why do they continue paying for it? Because they realize the cost savings that is actually they're going to realize from that drug is going to be far more than the amount that the insurance company is going to pay. So there's an example where the price is tethered to the value that's created. Right? Mm-hmm. So it's creating value for the entire system, right? But then the other part of the equation that I talked about, you have to connect it to a sense of fairness. And the thing I want to think about in terms of fairness is, maybe you want to think about, how do you, can your pricing, can you justify to the public why you set that price? And you have a message, you could do it, great. The other thing in terms of fairness to think about is, you want to avoid a disparate impact. So that means that identify if there are groups that are going to be disadvantaged from your pricing action. And if that does happen, perhaps you want to rethink your policy or introduce some type of mitigating programs. For example, some patients who are in the poverty level, do you offer some type of discounts to if they meet certain poverty guidelines? Or maybe some patients who might need that drug for a longer period of time, and it could be very, very expensive. So how do you make it more affordable to them, right? So who are these vulnerable groups where their welfare could actually be at risk, because they are then forced to turn to other methods of treatment which may not have the same amount of efficacy. And the way I like to think about pricing, especially when it really impacts health, is not everything should be all profit driven. Humanitarian reason is an instance. I know, for companies I've worked for in the past, sometimes we would actually introduce products where we actually don't make a profit, right? And for example, for this an Ebola drug that a company that I work for, for humanitarian reasons, that product was launched without really trying to make a profit. I'll pause here and see if others want to weigh in.
Yeah, I think you said something interesting there, David. It's probably like a middle ground, right? Like you've got your customers' willingness to pay, and maybe that hepatitis C drug, for example, maybe it's before you break even, you could probably charge 150,000, right? So but how's that going to be perceived by the market? How's it going to impact your goodwill and your brand's reputation, more broadly? And I think those are really important considerations, because while it doesn't translate directly to an income statement, and it's not black and white, it still has lasting impact on your brand. I can think of, Merck, which is, local to us, had a river blindness drug that they essentially gave away for free, because river blindness impacted some of the poorest third world countries around. And, they had a very effective drug or therapeutic for it. And they essentially gave it away. They've been doing it for 40 years. Now they've lost money for 40 straight years on that drug therapy, but I know about the story as a consumer of Merck products now, and I hold their brand in very high regard. So there is value to it. How much value? I think you have to. That's the real question: is where's that balance between your customers' willingness to pay, and then also measuring and layering on top of that the damage it can do to your brand in the macro market.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Tim. And I want to emphasize the point I made a little bit earlier, in case others have not, the audience haven't picked up on it. The two key things I think to think about is, what do you as a business stand for? And what are some of the goals that you're pursuing? And those things should help, I think, bound your how you want to set up that pricing, pricing strategy.
Yeah, and I think Jim, I would like to ask you that, because as a leader, I mean, you almost have to set that beforehand. You have to set those principles and that infrastructure beforehand as a leader, as you're thinking, so that when you do have this amazing drug that can help a lot of people in a big crisis, but you can charge maximum dollars for that. Your company, your people have worked very hard to get that whatever that product or service is out in the market. In my mind, like the capitalist in me says, you deserve the maximum reward for that, right? You should be able to receive the fruits of your labors there. But there is, to David's point, there is this, there's probably a middle ground where you can't go all the way to the top of the willingness to pay chart. But how do you do that as a leader? How do you think about that more from like an ethical sense, and establish those boundaries before you even start?
Yeah, it's kind of funny.
David, can you mute quickly, please? Thank you.
I came off. That did help, David. Look at that. I come off mute right when you asked that question, Tim, because it was what I was going to ask to David. Also, is the interesting conundrum that you find yourself in from the human perspective. So you can be very academic in this. You can be very analytical, but at the end of the day, and David, this will end up being a question to you because I'd love to have some insight to hear, is when you have, and Tim, I'll tie it together. I think it's very important for organizations to have a set of core values, right? Like you establish what is your North Star, what is your guiding path for you as an organization. And you've got to be very sincere with that. That can't be some exercise that you lock some people in the room and they come out with some very markety kind of stuff, right? It's got to be truly what you believe. But David, my question back to you would be, I'd love to know how you went through the decision-making process from your own core values. How does this affect you when you're sitting there and you have the analytics to back up everything that you've just discussed? How do you find yourself when you're sitting there talking to your boss, balancing your own morals and values and ethics as they start to compress against the company's core values, and how did you find yourself aligned to that?
Yeah, great question. And so I think for me, it boils down to a couple of things, or a few things. And let me get a little high level, and I'll get into the granular. Right. So one question I'd like to ask myself is this. And if everyone on the call, I ask you this simple question: what does winning look like for your business? How will you answer that question? Right, because part of the calculus and where you land on that price, not just for a specific product, but just generally speaking, may drive how you want to operate. Right, and I'll give you my own perspective, and every company is going to have differences. The way I like to look at what winning looks like is this. First of all, a company has above average value creation, meaning I'm making better stuff than my competitors on average. And the second thing is I'm gonna have above industry average returns to my stockholders, right? That means I'm actually going to return better. That means I'm going to deliver a higher return to my shareholders. So then, what's the role of pricing if you believe that's what winning looks like? So the role of pricing in that case is to be able to capture the value that your company create. Because if I'm creating better stuff, in order to generate more returns for my stockholders, then I have to be able to capture that value through price. So generally speaking, I want my pricing to be able to drive a lot of that value into stockholders. All right. So that's the first equation. So as we're pulling pricing strategies together, one of the things we look at is how are we creating value for our customers? In this case, maybe in the case of Juliet, not just for the patient, but for the healthcare system overall. And is this drug going to reduce the total overall cost? And I think what you'll find is sometimes these blockbuster drugs or products that I've launched in the past, we actually touched upon this last week, where we're actually creating a lot of value, because even though we're charging, say, $3,000, $4,000 for a product, I'm saving the customer $10,000. Right? So if I can demonstrate, hey, I'm charging you, say, $3,000, but I'm saving you $10,000. So I'm only monetizing 3 of the 10,000, right? So if we as a company then can show, hey, I'm saving the system $10,000. Now we have to decide how much of the 10,000 do we monetize. Do you want to try to monetize all 10,000? You're probably not going to sell too many. Do you want to monetize 1,000? Then that doesn't go into what winning looks like, what we just talked about. Or do you, so then you have to decide as a company, do you push closer to 10 or do you push closer down towards 1? And that becomes a lot of those ethical constraints that we started conversations on. And I think if there's a humanitarian reasons, I would probably tend pushing it lower, right? If a humanitarian reason is not involved, maybe I push it a little bit higher. So I think it's a case by case example, and those are some of the things that I would try to think about. And you also have to be mindful of, you do not create a disadvantage for disparate groups. So that's as you start pulling together a pricing strategy. And there are some of those exposures, then you come up with programs where you could actually accommodate for them. Did that help answer the question, Jim?
Yeah, it did. I'd like to know also, I want to kind of dive a little bit deeper though. When you're having this, it's still almost an academic discussion about how you're driving it. What is your personal pressures that you think from a human dynamic? What are the personal pressures that you and your team would have to face on when you think you're getting to your ethical ceiling in a way? When do you feel it starts to cross, and how do you personally run your teams a little bit? What are some of the things that you do, the techniques that you're kind of in a balance between your own personal morals and values and driving to this winning?
Yeah, good question. I would say, I mean, at what point does it really push a company? I would say in a scenario where the company is struggling for revenue, right? And you're looking to grow, and you don't see maybe a volume as a mechanism to drive the growth, and you're just seeing just tremendous industry pressure across the board, and price can actually help alleviate some of that. That starts pushing I think that starts pushing a little bit kind of how you might want to think about it. And the way I'll give you, and this is a real world example. And I've shared this, I think, in our last call. I've actually raised prices on some products by 100%, and I've raised prices on products by 300%. Okay. So then how do we pressure test and say, hey, is that fair and is that ethical? I'll give you an example of the products that we raised by 100%. What we discovered is that our price was actually, at least at a list price level, significantly below our competitor. Right? So our competitors' prices are way up here, and we're down here. So even by raising 100%, I'm only up here. I'm not even at where my competitor is. So once I do that pressure test, I say, hey, I feel comfortable taking my prices up by 100% in that scenario because we've mispriced that product. That's one example. Another example, you say, well, why did we raise price by 300% and we were successful in doing it? That was an example I mentioned a little bit earlier. We think we create, say $10,000 of value. We've been pricing this product at $1,000, right? So we thought we underpriced it. We look back at what does winning look like, the concept we talked about. Could we still message to the customer they're still getting a hell of a deal? Absolutely. In fact, we were very open up for the customer, say, hey, look, we think we've underpriced this product. You guys are still getting a hell of a deal. And it went okay. You know what? One surgeon actually told us, they said, by the way, I was wondering for years why you guys haven't raised the price on that product for so long, because I thought we were getting a hell of a deal at $1,000, right? So those are things that we try to pressure test it. Now, in the examples where you don't have those opportunities and you may think you push that limit, that's where I would start capping some of those pricing actions. Did that make sense, Jim?
Yeah, it makes total sense.
Hey, let's raise it up a little bit here and get back to the leadership aspect of this, right? So David's done a phenomenal job of talking about the data set that leaders could use to effectively make their decisions. But if you look at this Gilead example that was in the newspaper this morning, you've got a relatively new CEO who took over a company that was led the same way for almost 2 decades by a very hard-driving C-suite that put profits over everything else historically. You can go back and look at example after example of how they introduced drugs and how they maximize pricing. So they were incredibly shareholder focused in the way they delivered results to the business. The new CEO's taken over. He's already got criticized for an acquisition he made for a drug that treats a rare intestinal disorder. They bought the drug. The drug used to sell for $15 a pill. It cost about $1 a pill to manufacture, and Gilead instantly introduced the pill at $750 a pill instead of $15, and the total course of treatment would cost $64,000. So this new CEO is sitting there looking at this, and he's comparing it to the hepatitis C example, which was $84,000, and he's saying, hey, we're still 25% cheaper than our hepatitis C regimen, and you guys are crushing me for this when we're actually presenting good value and fair pricing to the market. The government did an investigation. This guy got pummeled. So now you're the CEO of Gilead. All of you guys on the phone, on the online here, are CEO of Gilead, and you're sitting here and you got this COVID crisis, which you want to say it's media exaggerated or it's not media exaggerated, however you want to view this crisis. The COVID-19 is in the news. It's in all the federal governments. It's all around the world. You've got a potential therapeutic that's going to work, and everybody's looking at you and saying, what are you going to do? Your shareholders are saying, you got a chance to make a good profit here. Why not? And the government and the consumers are saying, don't do this because we're going to be all over you if you do. What's the decision? Joe, if you're the CEO of Gilead, how do you balance that decision?
Well, it's funny. I think it comes back to what David said. It depends on what that company's North Star is. But I think if you're in the business of creating drugs for the betterment of people's lives, they're going to have their drugs they create. They're going to have their companies that they acquire where they're going to make their tremendous margins. But I think here's an opportunity to do good. I don't know the ins and outs of what's going on scientifically, but my understanding of the way things are it is being, I guess, expeditiously moved through the process for approvals, which typically would take a lot longer, which would cost a lot more money to develop a drug. So the developmental side, I think, would be a lot less expensive, I would think. David, you could probably speak to that. I don't know. So I think here's an opportunity to do the right thing by people, and you're going to have plenty of other drugs where they're going to make their money. Now, it's not going to be, the shareholders won't be happy about that, but at the same time, I think I just think it's the right thing. I think it's the right thing to do. It's just the right thing to do, in my opinion.
Okay, so let me throw a little curve at you. So Gilead's potentially going to lose $1 billion a year if they do the right thing. So that's $1 billion a year of shareholder value. And I know we're talking about human lives. I know we're talking about drugs, so I'm not trying to minimize that. But at the same time, you've got nobody going to Amazon and saying, hey, you're selling toilet paper for $8 for 6 rolls now, and it used to be $2.50. And so you're tripling your profit on that toilet paper. We don't think you should do that. We think you should do the right thing and sell toilet paper for what you used to sell it for. And if you happen to lose $1 billion of opportunity, so what? It's doing the right thing during a crisis. Nobody's saying that to Amazon,
Sure.
But they're going after the drug companies this way. So do you think that's fair?
No, I don't think that's fair, but I think there's a compound effect to this. So them raising the drug prices, the insurance companies paying more money for it, in turn raises the insurance price. I mean, our premiums have been going up ridiculous percentages every year, except for this past year, actually. But there is a trickle down effect to it. I think with the toilet paper scenario you mentioned, Mike, I don't think that's fair at all. But once this is all done, that goes away. It goes back to normal. This drug price is not going to go away and go back to normal. There is a trickle down effect to this. So I think there's a bigger impact to this. And to your point, yeah, I mean, can we minimize, or can they minimize that $1 billion loss to be less? I don't know. I don't know what the right numbers are, but I think there has to be a balancing act.
What if,
Tim, what's your opinion on this?
What if you just, like, if you were the CEO of this, in this situation where you've got this treatment, right? But we're looking at the COVID, and the fatality rate for generally a younger crowd isn't, it's not, you don't have an 80% chance of dying if you contract this thing. So, what if they did more of like a PR campaign where it's, hey, I'm going to give this stuff out to the most vulnerable population, the folks that are the most susceptible to succumbing to something like this, and then charging max fee willingness to pay for the rest of the population. I mean, it's price discrimination, but David, is there a legal boundary there? Is there some outside the box type of thinking you can do here?
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt your answer, David, but they've done a version of that. They've offered up 200,000 doses for free for critical, serious patients, and then after that 200 doses is exhausted, then they would go to their full pricing model.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm in the demographic that has a pretty good chance of surviving this thing, a really good chance of surviving this thing. So, I mean, at what point do you say, hey, I probably shouldn't be getting this, as a consumer, I probably shouldn't be getting this for free. This company is a company that's invested, billions of dollars into just drug discovery. And, David, you probably know this stat, but, more of them fail than actually succeed. And when you do have one that succeeds, you need to squeeze profit out of that, because it's going to fund your next 8 failures. So I think there's a messaging component to this where, everybody paints the drug companies as bad guys because they see their health premiums going up. But there are a lot of other variables out there that drive prices north. It's not always the pharma company that's the bad guy. How do you tell that story? I think is probably is a variable in the calculus of what the solution for the CEO would be. I think there's this is an area or a lane that should be, leaders should be focused in, is telling that story and getting people to buy into to understanding, hey, why am I charging this price in the market?
Yeah, Tim, I think Tim nails it. And if I can add to what Tim is saying, And I want to. I think everybody remembers Martin Shkreli, who's the former CEO of Turing Pharmaceuticals. And if you guys remember the story, I'll be quick about a story and relate it back to what we're talking here, right? So he bought this drug called Daraprim. It's a drug that's like 60 plus years old. There's no generics on it. It was priced at $13.50, and he raised it 5,400% because that product was so underpriced. What he did was actually, from a value pricing perspective, actually makes a lot of sense, because he said, hey, look, typically where drugs are priced for rare disease, $13.50 per pill is well below where the market is, right? So what he did was he actually took it to actually a little bit below the market, and yet there was this uproar, right? The public, the medical community, and the politicians in election year couldn't get past the 5,400% increase, right? So he drew so much attention to himself and his company. He was eventually prosecuted, not for the pricing, because the pricing was completely legal, but for something else that he did, right? Which is he was a hedge fund manager, and there are a lot of issues around how he managed a hedge fund, but it drew so much attention. In my opinion on this matter is, because this one has so much public attention, you have politicians involved in an election year, right? If you're going to paint yourself to be just someone who's a gouge price, I personally think you're going to lose in the long run.
So
that's
another consideration. Right? It's another consideration for the CEO, where the issues become politicalized, and he's got to add political pressure to shareholder pressure as well as consumer pressure. So it makes it incredibly hard to be a CEO in the pharma business. And we do have some people online, and I thank you very much for joining us today. And one comment from Karina talking about after Hurricane Andrew in Florida, the state enacted laws that prohibit price gouging, and there are a lot of state price gouging laws. So I agree with what you're saying. I actually did some research on that space, and I found that rarely does price gouging, if at all, apply to pharma. They've never really been charged with price gouging in that effect. And in this case, this is a brand new drug that doesn't have a price yet. So we're starting from scratch. So it's very hard to compare, because they're not taking an existing drug and just raising the price 5,000%. But I was surprised to see that price gouging really gets applied to the pharmaceutical industry. It gets applied to other industries. And you've got minor examples during this pandemic where there was that guy, I think he was either in Tennessee or Kentucky, who filled his garage up with hand sanitizer. He and his brother drove around with a pickup truck to every Dollar General store and bought every bottle of hand sanitizer they could. And he was selling it on eBay, and eBay shut him down. And then I had heard a rumor that the state confiscated his stash of hand sanitizer. So in that case, you've got an individual contributor doing things at a very small scale who got legal action taken, but you have these big, huge companies that just seem to skate past it over and over again.
Yeah. So price gouging in a state of emergency is actually illegal, and it's going to vary from state laws from state by state. Just so you know, there's no federal law on price gouging.
Nope.
And if you're not in a state of emergency, what you do, price is completely up to you as a business. Because there is no laws around that, right? So I want to make that clear to the audience.
Yep. So Jim Hotaling, I want to get back to you a little bit, and we've known each other for several years, and you've got an incredibly strong moral compass. So, you being the CEO of one of these companies, and you already brought up the core values aspect of it, and you go to almost any B school in the country, and the first thing they're going to tell you is businesses are in business to make money. And if businesses can make money, then they can fund a lot of good things like great corporate cultures, and they can support the core values. They can do sustainability. They can do public good, all kinds of great stuff. But if businesses don't make money, they can't afford to do any of that.
Yeah.
So, you're basically in business to make money. So, I want you to be a CEO of one of these pharma companies, and, I'll be one of the shareholders who's got billions of dollars invested in your company, and I'm pushing on you to optimize profit and telling you it's been done before, and historically it always just blows over when when you get critique from the public sector, and at the same time you're getting all kinds of pressure from activists and the general public to do the right thing. Play the mental Olympics for me. How
Yeah.
do you get through this?
I think it's simple, although obviously it's not. But control the narrative, right? Like it's interesting how we all brought in these small things. You know, Joe was talking about, okay, do they take $1 billion loss? You know, well, how much is the story, the good news story, going to cost? That story has value to it, right? So it's not really going to lose $1 billion. To Tim's point about how you've got to find some sort of compass, I think that's very important. And how David was talking about what was really interesting. This I was thinking about controlling the narrative the entire time, Mike. When David was saying it's very simple to say that if we were going to charge somebody $8,000 for something, but it was going to cost them $32,000 for the treatment, so it's saving money. It's figuring out how to draw the right narrative so that everybody goes, oh, well, okay, it doesn't matter that you increased it 300% because you're saving so much money. I think it's critically important that you get into this marketing play, someone that knows how to tell a story so you can connect the line. So you're going to get the pressure from the shareholder that's saying you got to, max the profit. I think you can turn to them and say, we are going to maximize for where our core values are. You're going to take it all the way to the edge of that. You're going to go to the consumer and you're going to go, we're maximizing the value to you, to David's point about bringing in the values and all that stuff. If you can tell the story, you can shape the future. And I think that's just the point of it, right? Is finding that sweet spot, the X of value to the shareholders, value to the consumer, and that story sweet spot right in the middle. If you can do that, then you win all the way around.
All right. One addition. So Jacqueline joined us again, and thank you, Jacqueline. I think you've been on every episode so far, and I also think you've been on some of our other episodes on Tuesday through Friday. So thank you very much for that. But Jacqueline said decision shouldn't be predicated on whether or not it's an election year that you do right. I agree with that. Unfortunately, we just see over and over again that things do get politicized, and even a virus has somehow turned into a political lever for different parties. So once again, Jim, as the CEO, how do you neutralize those political pressures? Can you do that with the narrative?
That's tough. Yeah, you look at the title of this show, The Prism, right? Because you can see one thing and 15 stories pop out of it, right? And so from politics, one person's looking at it from, viewpoint A, and you can flip the coin and look at it at viewpoint B from the other political party. That's a tough one, right? Usually Joe said a little earlier, you got to do the right thing. Almost everybody knows what right looks like. And if you can find that balance of what right looks like, that's the best way you can do it. But at the end of the day, politics has a little bit of tension that always goes with it. And I don't know if you're ever going to make everybody happy. You never will, really.
At what point do we put some of the onus on the consumer, though, right? Like if I'm a consumer, if I'm beating up pharma companies who are providing me life-saving drugs in pretty much any ailment I have now and to the foreseeable future, if we can all agree that pharma companies do more good than bad, right? Which I think there are probably some folks that disagree, but I think the majority of us would agree that we don't want to. I guess my point is we don't want to de-incentivize these folks from acting really quickly in a COVID crisis, right? Because if I'm a CEO in this example or this scenario, and I know I'm going to be losing $1 billion if I come out with this therapy, I'm not going to even do it. Why even do it? I'll leave it for my competitor to go lose $1 billion and maybe get the goodwill. And you're going to have to make that calculus in your head. But what we should want as a population is all of the pharma companies out there to be trying to get this therapy on the market as quickly as possible, and not de-incentivize, or incentivize, behavior where they're not going to even try.
So that's a great point. That's a great point, Tim. But that's always been the lever that the pharma companies pull. Like if you aren't willing to pay what we need to charge, then we can't produce these drugs. We can't produce them quickly enough. We can't do the R&D and the research we need to do, and people are going to die. So that's the lever they've always had to pull, and they do pull it frequently. And I don't hear that debated too much, except in times when you get back to David's sense of fairness. So we also got a comment from Daniel online, and he pretty much states it very well, where he says, hey, if you're a pharma company and you're a manufacturer and engaged in producing life-saving products, you have as much social responsibility to the end customer as you have to your shareholders. And if you can find a way to balance that, if you make your shareholders happy and they understand that being a shareholder of your company means having that social responsibility attached to it, then everything should be good, because that sense of fairness David talked about exists. Where you get into debates is when people look at farmers' P&Ls and they say, hey, Gilead's making over $1 billion a year on that one hepatitis drug in profit. What they don't do is go to the next step and say, once Gilead makes that $1 billion in profit on the hepatitis drug, they took 900 million of that billion and put that into R&D for a next generation drug for something else. That narrative doesn't get continued, and that's something that, based on what Jim just said, is something I think, CEOs could do a little bit better, is literally connect the dots for the general public of where, and then show them the flow of money and how it gets reinvested into constantly making, bigger and better therapeutics.
I think that's my point, though. I think there's everybody points the finger at business, but we should be pointing the finger in the mirror as consumers to say, it's dependent upon me to go find that information out. And yeah, I'm sure you could go to Gilead's site and they're going to tell you exactly how much they invest in R&D, and you're going to be able to make that connect those dots as an educated consumer. But so often we just listen to the headline in a newspaper or on TV or whatever. That just goes to the first layer. I mean, we are not critical thinkers anymore, and there's secondary and tertiary levels that we need to explore to make a wise conclusion on this stuff. I think we need to, as a society, be more open to the fact that businesses are out there to make a profit, but they also reinvest those profits into making and advancing, our lives.
I think, Tim,
so you got to back society up 10 years, because back in the early 2000s and probably right up into 2005, 6, 7, it was good for companies to be successful. They employed more people, they gave bigger raises, the return on their shareholders, and over the last 5 years, success is not viewed so much by the general public as a good thing. Now success is viewed as somehow you're abusing the system, somehow you're taking advantage of something if you're successful. So there's this groundswell now that, even the move towards socialism, whatever you want to call it, businesses aren't looked at favorably if they're uber successful. It's looked at as they must be taking advantage of somebody if they're uber successful. So
and that's
I would love to get back to the days when businesses were thriving because they were making big profits and they were reinvesting those profits in sustainability, their people, their shareholders, et cetera, without getting criticized for it.
I think that's why it's important. You say control the narrative, because Tim, you're right. Nobody's gonna go into page 56 of an annual report and go, aha, that's why they do it. So you control the narrative. It's got to be very simply stated on how you tell this story. It just does. And that's the sweet spot. You got to be able to make a very complicated thing simple for the consumer. And we're not saying the consumer is a simple person. It just has to be a simple, easy, quick story.
And maybe one of the things to think about in terms of that storytelling. I'm not the best storyteller, but I'm the pricing business guy. But the way I like to think of these kind of things, especially in a humanitarian situation, is our goal is to be able to eliminate or mitigate the impact of COVID-19 as much as possible. So if I think of a triad, what we're trying to do here is, one, if you have a drug that's of value, right, that meets one of those triads, and the other bucket is going to be around accessibility. So I want to have as many people to have access to my drug as possible, and then it's got to be affordable. But if our mission in this case is eliminate COVID-19, can you set a price where you limit access and you limit affordability? And that could harm your mission, right? So that's something to think about as a CEO as well, is there's value. I can capture it with price, but I got to think about accessibility, because my mission is be able to kill off that COVID-19 as best you can. And if it's not affordable, then we may fail in our mission. So I think those three things between the value, the accessibility, and affordability comes into play as a CEO.
Oh, great answer. I think that's a great place to wrap it up. And so we've had great discussion the last 2 weeks. And like I said, last week we talked about some of the tactical parts of pricing and the strategic parts of pricing. Today we pivot into the moral and ethical dilemmas that CEOs face. And we've also found that when you're assessing those moral and ethical dilemmas, the pricing comes back into play, and you still got that tactical and strategic part of pricing that you got to put into your decision-making model. And each industry is different. Amazon's going to get treated differently in this case than a big pharma company, even though they're both delivering products that help people get through the crisis. They're delivering very different types of, toilet paper is very different from a pill you're going to take that's going to be a therapeutic if you actually catch the virus. But at the end of the day, I think what I appreciate more and more as you go through this is the pressure that's on a CEO and his leadership team. You do have intense shareholder pressure. People invested billions of dollars in your company. They expect a return. You've got intense activist group pressure. A lot of those have their own personal political agendas for doing that. And then you're going to have the consumer acceptance or pushback based on that sense of fairness, which I think we highlighted both last week and this week, is one of the keys here. It doesn't really matter how high you price your product. If the end user, consumer side, whether it's the insurance company or the individual, has a sense of fairness when they pay that price, you're all set. You're in good shape, no matter what the price is. And I think determining what that sense of fairness and how that end user consumer is going to react is kind of a critical decision point here. So great conversation again today. I wish we had a lot more time. I think this, could go on forever. We could start comparing and contrasting U.S. business and decision models in this space to the international models. They're very different when you've got federally sponsored, government-sponsored healthcare systems, and things are treated very differently and looked at very differently, paid for very differently. So internationally, it's a totally different picture. But great conversation today. For everybody online, I just want to remind you that the Prism is on every Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and the topics are going to continue to vary. We'll probably continue with the major theme of leading through a crisis for the foreseeable future, but we'll continue to introduce new subtopics, new guest speakers, et cetera, et cetera. And please tune in for End of Growth's other shows, Tuesday through Friday, also at 11 a.m. All kinds of great topics going on all week with some very knowledgeable hosts and discussion panelists. So thank you for joining us today. Have a great morning. It's actually still morning here. So have a great morning, great afternoon, or great evening wherever you are. And thank you once again. And thank you to everybody online. David, it's always a pleasure. Great chatting with you and all the End of Growth employees that joined me. It's just great having you here. Thank you,
Thanks, David.
Hey, thank you for having me. Enjoyed
Thanks,
it.
everybody.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Take care.
Take care.